hear Susan in the beginning say, from the top, Saddam Hussein. They were willing to concede to everything we wanted. Despite the garbage you saw right before we invaded that was done by a well-known, I think it was 60 Minutes, team that went over. What you didn't know is that after that was shot, Susan Lindauer was doing her work over there. And when Saddam realized he was going to be taken out one way or the other, and you should get her book. Go look it up, Susan Lindauer. Go look up her book. I'm not going to give you the title. Do some more research of your own. Now, so we have Susan Lindauer before the invasion, before all the bad stuff happened. She's over there. Susan Lindauer is over there, and she gets what Bush demanded, except your mainstream media will not tell you boo, not a word of it. Saddam's bad. Saddam is doing this. Saddam is doing that. He rapes little girls. He takes them right out of grade school and does bad things to them. And his son is a beast. His son kills people. And all that's probably true. I don't doubt that Saddam was a foaming at the mouth, rabid, crazy lunatic. We put him in there because we knew he was crazy. Who put him in there? George Herbert Walker Bush and the Bush Crime Syndicate. They put Saddam Hussein in power decades before we took him out of power. Same thing we did with a little petty dictator down in Panama named Noriega. We put Noriega in so he would cut big percentages of the drug smuggling to the CIA. The CIA is out, you get outside the United States, most people know, it's the biggest drug controlling ring in the world. They have off-budget funding from the drugs. Hello, are you listening? It's up to you to do the research. All I can do is point you in the direction, because most of you, if you're hearing this for the first time, you're simply going to not believe it. But that's why I wanted you to hear Susan Lindauer. So when you hear the next guest, which is on video, and I wasn't there when he was making this speech at Bascom Hall in Madison, Wisconsin. His name is David. He did quite a bit of research. And you really ought to pay attention to his research. So we'll go to David and listen to what you probably never, ever heard, even though Bascom Hall is packed and there are no empty seats. He's speaking to an intelligent audience. I give you David.
And carried out the attacks of 9/11 is simply too horrible to entertain. Unfortunately, however, there is considerable evidence for this view. And if we find this evidence convincing, the implications for resistance to the U.S. empire building project are radical. As Basovich has emphasized, the only remaining debate about the American empire is whether it is benign. The interpretation of 9/11 is relevant to this debate because it would be very difficult to accept either the third or the fourth interpretation and still consider American imperialism benign. So I now turn to some of the evidence that supports these views. I will look first at evidence that supports at least the third view, according to which U.S. officials had foreknowledge of the attacks. A central aspect of the official story about 9/11 is that the attacks were planned entirely by Al-Qaeda, with no one else knowing the plans. A year after the attacks, FBI Director Robert Mueller said, "To this day, we have found no one in the United States except the actual hijackers who knew of the plot." Since that time, federal officials have had to admit that they had received far more warnings prior to 9/11 than they had previously acknowledged. But these admissions, while raising the question of why further safety measures were not in place, do not necessarily show that the federal officials had specific foreknowledge of the attacks. One could still, as the 9/11 Commission did, accept the conclusion published at the end of the 2002 Congressional Joint Inquiries Report, which said that none of the intelligence gathered by the U.S. intelligence community identified the time, place, and specific nature of the attacks that were planned for September 11th, 2001. Unfortunately for the official account, however, there are reports indicating that federal officials did have that very specific kind of information. I will give two examples. The first example involves Attorney David Shippers, who had been the chief prosecutor for the impeachment of President Clinton. 2 days after 9/11, Shippers declared that he had received warnings from FBI agents about the attacks 6 weeks earlier. Warnings that included both the dates and the targets. These agents had come to him, Shippers said, because FBI headquarters had blocked their investigations and had threatened them with prosecution if they went public with their information. Because FBI headquarters had blocked their investigations and had threatened them with prosecution if they went public with their information. And had threatened them with prosecution if they went public with their information. And had threatened them with prosecution if they went public with their information. So they asked Shippers to use his influence to get the government to take action to prevent the attacks. And Shippers surely, as the prosecutor of Clinton, should have had influence in Republican circles. And yet he reports that he tried to contact Attorney General Ashcroft, and Ashcroft repeatedly refused to return his calls. Shippers' allegations about the FBI agents were then corroborated in a story by William Norman Grigg called "Did We Know What Was Coming?", which was published in The New American, a conservative magazine. According to Grigg, the three FBI agents he interviewed told him that the information provided to Shippers was widely known within the FBI before September 11th. If Shippers, Grigg, and these agents are telling the truth, it would seem that when FBI Director Mueller claimed that the FBI had found no one in this country with advanced knowledge of the plot, he was not telling the truth. The government also would have had foreknowledge of the attacks because of an extraordinarily high volume of put options purchased in the 3 days before 9/11. To buy put options for a particular company is to bet that its stock price is going to go down. These purchases were for two and only two airlines, American and United, the two airlines whose planes were used in the attacks, and also for Morgan Stanley Dean Whitter, which occupied 22 stories of the World Trade Center. The price of these shares did, of course, plummet after 9/11. As the San Francisco Chronicle said, these unusual purchases, which resulted in profits of at least tens of millions of dollars, raised suspicions that the investors had advanced knowledge of the strikes. Suspicions that the investors had advanced knowledge. For our purposes, the most important implication of this story follows from the fact that U.S. intelligence agencies monitor the market looking for signs of imminent untoward events. These extraordinary purchases, therefore, would have suggested to intelligence agencies that in the next few days, United and American airliners were going to be used in attacks on the World Trade Center. That is fairly specific knowledge. These two examples then imply the falsity of the joint inquiry statement that none of the intelligence gathered by the U.S. intelligence community identified the time, place, and specific nature of the attacks. Indeed, one of the FBI agents interviewed by William Grigg said, "Obviously, people had to know. It's terrible to think this, but this must have been allowed to happen as part of some other agenda." He was right. This would be terrible. There is considerable evidence, however, that the full truth is even more terrible. That the reason some officials had foreknowledge of the attacks is because they had planned them. That the reason some officials had foreknowledge of the attacks is because they had planned them. Foreknowledge of the attacks is because they had planned them. The evidence for this fourth view consists of features of the attacks in conjunction with behavior of U.S. officials that cannot be explained on the assumption that the attacks were planned and executed entirely by foreign agents. I will give 4 examples. One feature of the attacks that suggests complicity by U.S. officials is the twofold fact that the U.S. military failed to stop the attacks on 9/11, and that then, since then, they have given us 3 different stories as to why they failed. These changing stories suggest that the military has been trying to cover up the fact that a stand-down order was given on 9/11, canceling the military's own standard operating procedures for dealing with hijacked airplanes. It is certainly clear that some agency, either the military or the FAA, failed to follow standard procedures on 9/11. When these procedures are followed, the FAA, as soon as it sees signs that a plane may have been hijacked, calls military officials, who then call the nearest Air Force base with fighters on alert, telling it to send up a couple of fighters to intercept the plane. Such interceptions usually occur within 10 to 20 minutes after the first sign of trouble. This is a routine procedure happening about 100 times a year. If you've read the story in Popular Mechanics, you know, one of their big lies is, oh, gee, there's only been one such interception in the last several years. No, it's a routine procedure, about 100 times a year. On 9/11, however, it did not happen. Why not? The military's first story was that no planes were sent up until after the Pentagon was hit. The military leaders were admitting, therefore, that they had left their fighters on the ground for almost 90 minutes after the FAA had first noticed signs of a possible hijacking. This first story suggested to many people that a stand-down order must have been given. By the end of the week, the military had put out a second story saying that it had sent up fighters